And continuing with Grey Fox from the Golden Harp from the Grey King, Will has met up with Bran playing the harp at John Rowland's. Something was off about it. He couldn't figure out what. I couldn't figure out what, or I would try to give you a hint. He's worried that it was Bran's dog that may have attacked the missing sheep, but Bran says the dog is with his dad and reminds Will that it is Halloween. Before he could say more, they were at the door of the cottage. It was half open, a low, heavy door set in the stone wall. At Bran's footsteps, the dog Cattle came bounding out, a small white whirlwind, leaping and whining with pleasure, licking his hand. It was noticeable that he did not bark. From inside, a man's voice called, "Bran!" and began speaking in Welsh. Then, as Will followed Bran through the door, the man speaking, standing shirt-sleeved at the table, turned in mid-sentence and caught sight of him. He broke off at once and said formally, "I beg your pardon." "This is Will," Bran said, tossing his bag of books on the table. "Mr. Evans's nephew." "Yes, I thought perhaps it was. How do you do, young man?" Bran's father came forward, holding out his hand. His gaze was direct and his handshake firm, though Will had an immediate curious feeling that the real man was not there behind the eyes. "I am Owen Davies. I have been hearing about you." "How do you do, Mr. Davies?" said Will. He was trying not to look surprised. Whatever he had expected in Bran's father, it was not this. A man so completely ordinary and unremarkable, whom you could pass on the street without noticing he had been there. Someone as odd as Bran should have had an odd father, but Owen Davies was all medium and average height, medium brown hair in a medium quantity, a pleasant ordinary face with a slightly pointed nose and thin lips, an average voice, neither deep nor high, with the same precise enunciation that Will was beginning to learn belonged to all North Welshmen. His clothes were ordinary, the same shirt and trousers and boots that would be worn by anyone else on a farm. Even the dog that stood at his side, quietly watching them all, was a standard Welsh sheepdog, black-backed, white-chested, black-tailed, unremarkable, not like Caffel, just as Bran's father was not at all like Bran. "There's tea in the pot, Bran, if you would both like a cup," Mr. Davies said. "I have had mine. I am off over to the big pasture, and I shall be going out tonight. There's a chapel meeting. Miss Evans will give you your supper." "That's good," said Will cheerfully. "He can help me with my homework." "Homework?" said Bran. "Oh, yes, this isn't just a holiday for me, you know. They gave me all kinds of work from school, so I shouldn't get behind algebra today and history." "That will be very good," Mr. Davies said, earnestly, pulling on his waistcoat. "So long, Bran. Take care to do his own work as well." "So long as Bran takes care to do his own work as well, of course. I know he will do that well. It is nice to meet you, Will. See you later, Bran. Cattle can stay." And he went out, nodding to them amiably, but with complete seriousness, leaving Will to reflect that, after all, there was one thing about Owen Davies that was not altogether common. He had not a glimmer of laughter in him. There was no expression in Bran's face. He said flatly, "My father is a big one for chapel. He is a deacon, and there are 2 or 3 meetings for him in a week. We go twice on Sundays." "Oh," Will said. "Yes, I was right. Want a cup of tea?" "Not really, thank you." "Let's go out, then." With absent-minded conscientiousness, Bran rinsed out the teapot and left it neatly inverted on the draining board. "Heard your ma, Capel." The white dog bounded happily beside them as they crossed the fields, away from cottage and farm, up the valley toward the mountains, in a lone near park. It stood at a right angle to the mountains behind it, jutting into the flat valley floor. "Funny how that rock sticks out like that," Will said. "Craig Yard Inn. That's special. It's the only place in Britain where cormorants nest inland. Not very far inland, of course. 4 miles from the sea we are here. Haven't you been over there? Come on. We've got time." Bran changed direction slightly. "You can see the birds fine from the road." "I thought the road was that way," Will said, pointing. "It is. We can cut across it this way. Bran opened a gate onto a footpath, crossed the path, and scrambled over the walls on the other side. The only thing is, you must go quickly, he said with a grin. This is Caradog Pritchard's land. Hush, Cavil, Will said in a heavy stage whisper, turning his head, but the dog was not there. Will paused, puzzled. Bran, where's Cavil? Bran whistled. They both stood waiting, looking back at the long sweep of the slate-edged stone wall along the stubbled field. Nothing moved. The sun shone. Far away sheep called. Bran whistled again, with no result. Then he went back, with Will close behind, and they climbed over the wall again and went down the footpath they had crossed. Bran whistled a third time, and he called in Welsh. There was concern in his voice. Will said, Wherever could he have gone? He was right beside me when I came over the wall. He never does this, never. He will never go from me without permission, or not come when he is called. Bran gazed anxiously up and down the footpath. I don't like it. I shouldn't have let him come so near Mr. Pritchard's land. You and me is one thing, but Cavil, he whistled again, loud and desperate. You don't suppose, Will said, and stopped, that Pritchard will shoot him the way he said? No, I was going to say you don't suppose Cavil wouldn't come because he knew he shouldn't go on Mr. Pritchard's land. But that's silly. No dog could work out something like that. Oh, Bran said unhappily. Dogs can work out things a lot more complicated than that. I don't know. Let's try this way. It leads to the river. They set off along the path, away from the looming mass of rock, Craig Yarden. Somewhere ahead of them, a long way off, a dog barked. Is that him? Will said hopefully. Bran's white head was cocked on one side. The dog barked again, closer. No, that's John Rowland's big dog, Pen. But Cavil might have gone that way when he heard him. They both broke into a run along the stony grass-patched path. Will very soon lost his breath and dropped behind. Bran disappeared round a bend in the path ahead of him. When Will turned the corner himself, two things slammed simultaneously into his consciousness. The sight of Bran, without Cavil, talking to his father and John Rowlands, and the sick certainty that something evil had taken control of everything that was happening now on Clewed Farm. It was a recognition, like the sudden sensing of an overwhelming sound or smell. He came up panting behind them, and as Bran said, Heard Pen bark, and thought he might have come this way, so we came running. And you saw nothing at all? Owen Davies said. His face was tight with some deep concern. Looking at it, Will felt foreboding clutch at the pit of his stomach. John Rowland said, his deep voice strained, And you, Will, did you see anything along the path just now? Will started. No, only Cavil before, and now we've lost him. No creature came past you? Nothing at all. Why? What's wrong? Owen Davies said bleakly. In the big pasture up the way there are 4 dead sheep with their throats torn out, and there's no gate open or any sign of what can have attacked them. Will looked in horror at John Rowlands. Is it the same? Who can tell? Said the shepherd bitterly. Like Davies, he seemed to be caught between distress and rage. But it is not dogs. I do not see how it could be dogs. It looks more like the work of foxes, though how that can be I do not know. The Milgren from the hills, said Bran. Nonsense, his father said. The what? Said Will. The Milgren, Bran said. His eyes were still darting round in search of Cavil as he spoke automatically. Grey foxes. Some of the farmers say they are big grey foxes that live up in the mountains, bigger and faster than our red foxes down here, Owen Davies said. That is nonsense. There are no such things. I have told you before I will not have you listening to those rubbishy old tales. His tone was sharp. Bran shrugged. But across the front of Will's mind there came suddenly a brilliant image, clear as a film thrown on a screen. He saw 3 great foxes trotting in a line, enormous grey-white animals with thick coats growing to the broadness of a ruff round their necks and full brush-like tails. They moved across a hillside among rocks, and for an instant one of them turned its head and looked full at him with bright, unwinking eyes. For that instant he could see them as clearly as he could see Bran. Then the image was gone. They were vanished, and he was standing again in the sunshine, mute, dazed, knowing that in one of the brief communications that can come very rarely, Only very rarely, unguarded from one old one to another, his masters had sent him a warning picture of the creatures of the Grey King, agents of the dark. He said abruptly, "They aren't tales. Bran is right." Bran stared at him, shaken by the crisp certainty in his voice, but Owen Davies looked across in chilly reproof. The corners of his thin mouth turned down. "Don't be a foolish boy," he said coldly. "What can you know of our foxes?" Will never knew what he could have said in answer, for breaking into the tense stillness of the sunlit afternoon came a shout from John Rowland, urgent, loud. "Tan, look over there! There is fire on the mountain! Fire!" And that is the end of Grey Fox.